So we've got the last section of the day now, and I will now introduce Dame Colette Bowe from the UK Statistics Authority.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much, Helen, and good afternoon, everyone. As Helen has said, I'm a non-exec on the board of the UK Stats Authority. Very nice to see a number of my colleagues from the ONS here. But I'm also, in other bits of my working life, I'm the chairman of something called the Banking Standards Board. So I spend a lot of my time in the city with people who run banks. And I'd like to draw on my experience in both of these roles in talking to you this afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking Keith Dugmore, who I have known for many years, for the invitation for me as a non-statistician, non-data scientist, to speak to you this afternoon. I've also got some thanks to somebody who's not here, which is my board colleague, Professor David Hand, with whom I've often discussed the kind of issues we're talking about today. I've got two questions I want to raise with us as a group, and they're both stemming from my kind of overarching question about how can we move from data to information. So, and the first one is how, in a world of absolutely colossal data availability, can we find assurance? And the second one, and it's one that we discussed in the session we just had, so it's a very nice segue from what we were talking about there, is how can we train people across our society in the arts of data interpretation? This is, as we all know, it's a core skill of empirical scientists of all kinds. But it's a core skill that the widespread availability of data, I believe, has made a core skill for everyone, not just the decision makers we were talking about in our last session. Now, all of that might sound like a slightly doomy way to start off. So before I dive in, I think we ought to just take a moment to say a word or two of collective praise and thanks for the world of data richness and accessibility that we now live in. As I look around this room, I think I am possibly the only person old enough to remember the days when you had to rely on a rather dusty copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica to do your geography homework, rather than being able to do what kids now can do, which is whiz around the internet, finding all sorts of fascinating facts about how many frost-free days you have to be a wheat-producing country and all of those other things. And again, looking back a bit, in my early professional life, I began my working life as an econometrician in the government economic service. I can remember very occasionally being invited to very grand meetings in Whitehall, where someone would turn to me, if I was lucky, long after whatever policy we were talking about had actually been decided. Somebody would turn to me and say, and do the numbers have anything to say about this? Obviously expecting the answer no. Now, of course, nowadays, no self-respecting policy discussion could take place without at least a 50-page slide deck, although I'm not totally sure the structure of those meetings nowadays is actually any different. Slide joking apart, I think as many of the discussions we've had today have shown, we are immensely fortunate to live in this world we inhabit, where in principle we have access to mountains, intimidatingly big mountains of data. Which brings me to the first question then. So in this world of huge availability of data, how can someone like me, I'm one of those decision makers we were talking about in the previous session, how can someone like me find assurance about data quality? Now, we've all got ways we do this, of course. We all develop more or less complex ways of triangulating, both in our personal and business lives. But what the majority of us do, I think, is a version of turning to professionals to satisfy us about the provenance of whatever data we're trying to assess and assure. Of course, as you all know, in the commercial world, most large organisations, in fact, in any sector, we develop and make use of second and third lines of assurance to give us comfort about quality. And of course, we all in our various lives make use of what you might very generically call branding of various kinds as shorthand for assurance and by implication for trust. That, of course, happens in all sorts of worlds. To take an example from a world very different from the one we're talking about this afternoon, if you think about the world of journalism, we all have trusted news brands that we turn to, especially when we want to know what's really happening. Of course, one person's trusted news brand is somebody else's hopelessly compromised and biased source. But one of the most, and in fact, just to continue this discussion about how this works in journalism, one of the most interesting things that's going on at the moment is the possible disintermediation of established journalism in favour of newer outlets, personal brands, and what a lot of the grandchildren do, which is just believing everything you read on Facebook. However, in the world that we all, I think, in this room operate in, of users of data relevant to UK public policy, of course, the most established brand is national statistics. And it's worth taking a moment or two to reflect on how this brand has over many years been developed and how it's being maintained. You all know that there's a long tradition in the UK statistical world of quality assurance, and under the present arrangements, which go back to 2008, these arrangements have been put onto a statutory footing, very welcome, and the task of assessing the quality of official statistics is explicit, it's accessible, it's resource intensive, and the results are made public. And that, I believe, is enormously important for the ability of users to have confidence in the quality of our official statistics, uncomfortable though the process of assessment may sometimes be for government statisticians. And make no mistake, it sometimes is extremely uncomfortable. Since 2008, over 1,000 data series have been assessed, over 1,000. And this major ongoing work of testing and retesting the quality of the statistical infrastructure is fundamental to the work of the UK Stats Authority. Now, this is not to say that UK official statistics are by any means perfect, both in terms of their quality or of their appositeness to this dynamic modern economy that we live in, with, for example, its fast-changing composition of its labour force. My point is simply that this public process of quality assessment can give users a degree of assurance through the medium of developing a trusted brand. So a brand can be shorthand for information about quality, and it's therefore one answer to my first question about how, in a world of very, very rich data, can we have assurances to quality. My second question is a very tricky one, and as I said, it goes back to what we were discussing in our previous session. it relates to what I believe is the need for the widespread acquisition of new skills. The new skills that we have to acquire as users, as decision makers, as citizens, are the skills that, as I said, they're core to scientists who work with data. They're the skills of interpreting what data might be telling you or what they might not. I rather soberly believe that the challenge of making such skills widely available is on a par with the challenge to acquire and spread literacy. I know that's a very big statement, but I think it's one I would like everyone to reflect on. The very specific application, of course, is how people whose job it is to make decisions on the basis of their interpretation of large data sets can get better at that. And I'm thinking here very specifically of people in leadership positions in large businesses whose jobs require them to distill meaning from very large amounts of complex data. Exactly what we were talking about half an hour ago in our workshop session. I think there are at least three sorts of problem that we, and you'll see now I've slightly changed my angle of vision and I'm now aligning myself with those who are in this room. I think there are three problems we need to help decision makers avoid when they are dealing with these large data sets. One is the perils of induction, or to be less elliptical about it, the perils of trying to seek for patterns without having any explanatory hypothesis. Second sort of problem, and I have to say I have seen this over and over and over again in boardrooms, is the problem of confirmation bias. You're all very familiar with that, I'm sure, in your own professional work. And the third problem is what I call the wrong problem mindset, by which I mean, for example, regarding an increase in the complaints data about your business as a sign that something is going wrong, rather than as a sign that something is going right, i.e. that your complaints handling procedures might be getting better. And again, that is a problem I've seen exemplified in businesses over and over again. So I think there are some tricky issues there for people who are trying to make decisions based on huge amounts of data without necessarily having the kind of training that all of you in this room have got. And so my key point this afternoon is we need to find a way to help people to search for and use data in the way that helps them to make the right decisions. I mean, sometimes, you know, what you're trying to do if you're sitting around a kind of boardroom table is you're trying to do what some colleagues of mine call spotting the canary in the mine, the telling detail that might just be telling you that something that you think is going okay actually isn't going okay at all. And being able to discriminate like that, rather than simply seize on something because it confirms, for example, a prejudice you've got, is an absolutely crucial skill. The challenge for all of us then is how can we help people whose decisions are important to all of us to make better decisions. Not only to have access to mountains of data, beautifully visualized, etc., but to be able to interpret it with confidence and skill. To my mind, this is the great challenge at the moment. It's a great challenge for business, but it's also a great challenge for our kind of society. I've described it as a challenge for citizens, and I think it's one of the things that I would most like to see children educated to be able to do with confidence and skill. Now, everybody in this room, I think, is somebody who is skilled in the disciplines that I've talked about. My challenge to you is I would really like you to think about the issue of how your skills can be more widely understood and applied. We spoke at the end of the workshop session about how, as analysts, as statisticians, as data scientists, you can acquire trust, how you can acquire credibility, how you can help people understand the pitfalls. All of that is really important, and I applaud that endeavour, and I would love to be able to support it. But there's a wider challenge here, which is, as I've said, to my mind, on a par with the challenge of spreading literacy and numeracy. It's the challenge of being able confidently to use the data that we increasingly have available to us. And I think it's the big challenge of this moment in this century. So the question is, how are we going to do it? Over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Very happy to take a few questions if anybody would like to ask me anything about anything I've just said.
At the back there.
I'm going to just put my specs on, but so I can see you, but it would be really helpful if you could tell us all who you are.
Mark Chivers from Boots. Do you require different levels of analysis and assurance as a non-exec to that as an exec?
I think the answer to that is normally yes, although it depends very much on the kind of business you're talking about, obviously. If you're an executive board member, you have got from your daily frequent contact with the people who are presenting to the board, you have had the opportunity to build up your confidence and trust in the professionalism of the people who are there. As a non-exec coming into a business, it can be much harder. It obviously gets easier over time. The longer you're on a board, you develop a sense of the people who have credibility and trust as well. But that is why, for example, you need to have second and third lines of defence, which become very important to a non-exec in order to be able to develop a kind of independent sense of what is valuable and what isn't. Now, it's slightly tricky, this, because, of course, as you all know, any good board that contains both non-execs and execs tries to function like a unitary board. You try not to kind of have this kind of them and us feeling inside a board. But I think you've got to be realistic about the fact that the non-execs don't spend as much time in the business. In businesses where I've sat on boards before now, I have often found that the most successful decision-making has come about when non-execs have been very happy to spend time outside the board meetings with core people in the business, enhancing their understanding of what is going to come to board meetings. But how would you see it from your standpoint? Does that all resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. I ask purely selfishly because as well as working for Boots in the day job, I'm a non-exec on a foundation trust. So I completely agree. It's just, I think the decision making as a non-exec is different, and the sort of three-legged stool of assurance, or the different sources of assurance, and the ability to drive assurance through personal interaction as well as seeing the data.
Yeah.
I think it is different. So I completely agree. I was just interested in the view.
Okay.
Question down at the front.
Thanks. I'm Hitan Shah, Director of the Royal Statistical Society. Thanks for a great presentation. I've just come from a round table which got together all the organisations that were fact-checking in the run-up to the general election.
Ah, yes.
So organisations like Full Fact, The Conversation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and so on. And this speaks to your first point about trusted brands being intermediaries providing good quality information. But one of the core problems is there's a free rider problem. Nobody wants to pay for the information that these organisations provide. And in fact, what was obvious was that the Nuffield Foundation had been a key foundation that had funded all of those organisations, and reliance on a single funder is obviously problematic. So I suppose from the kind of connections you've got in other worlds, what would your advice be to some of these small civil society organisations about how they might get the sort of financial support that they need to carry on?
First of all, Heaton, I should, as you know, declare an interest because I am a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, and it might therefore be thought to be not a total accident that these organisations do in fact get support from Nuffield. I think there are other sources of funding. I think one of the things we need people to do is to find a way of making some of the points I've tried to make this afternoon. That the kind of work that Full Fact does, the kind of things that IFS does, which are quite different, but each have their place. I think you've got to start telling that story. And I think this is a big job for the RSS, actually, Heaton, if I may say so. I'm not trying to sort of push it back onto you, but I think the RSS really needs to think quite hard about how to punch its weight in this debate. The RSS is a great institution, but I think we have got to sort of try and think more widely about how we can persuade our fellow citizens that being able confidently to handle data isn't just something that you do if you're some kind of geek or something. It's really important if you're going to kind of play a proper role in our society. And I think that's an absolutely core job for the RSS. And I think, you need to develop a narrative, but you also need to keep talking to people like Nuffield, actually, because for us, it's very much on point with our mission. But I think both the IFS and Full Fact did an absolutely cracking job in the run-up to the election, actually, and really contributed to the level of debate that took place around the election. Anybody else? I can see a hand right at the back.
David Best, ONS. I was very interested by your reference to empirical sciences at the beginning of your talk. I would guess that the majority of people here have at some stage in their career had training, formally or informally, in empirical sciences. I wonder if there's a case for including as perhaps not a regulatory, but a strongly recommended element of director level training, an analytics 101 type element. We have a lot of code for directors is now quite extensive.
Yeah.
But it makes no reference to the importance of empirics or analytics in a director's tool set. Do you think there's a market for that?
I think there's not only a market, I think there's a strong social need, actually, David. And I think, when I go around schools, for example, talking to sixth formers, I get quite concerned about people who are encouraged far too young to divert off into a version of the humanities that seems to exclude acquiring the kind of analytical skills that I've discussed this afternoon. I think the public discussion around things like coding is, to my mind, a bit of a red herring. Yes, coding is quite important. I learned to do it when I was a young econometrician. I've always been very glad I know how to do that. But actually, the kind of generic skill that I've talked about this afternoon, which is to be able to really discriminate very carefully in your understanding of different data sets, it's something that we can't start too early. And in my view, it's as important as in a completely different bit of my life, I think, learning to play a musical instrument is very important for different reasons to do with mental development. So I think it's a job for us all to collaborate on, actually. Helen, I think I've probably come to the end of my time. I'm slightly appalled to see that we have a blank screen here, because I had Keith contributed a slide which is a kind of outline of what I've just said this afternoon. I hope perhaps the organisers could email it around to people here at the conference so that you can get a sense of the organisation of my point. But I'd like to say thank you very much for allowing someone like me who's not, who's a decision maker rather than an analyst, to come and talk to you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.